I have just beaten Yatagarasu. It's my new hardest demon, and I'm going to show you my completion as well as everything I learned on the way to beating it. I've made a lot of these videos in the past about my previous completions, but a lot of those have been so long that, to be honest, I'm surprised any of you watched them. Hopefully this one will be more concise, and I'm just going to try and include the stuff that I think is absolutely necessary to know and that I learnt uniquely in my experience. Now, I will address an elephant in the room, is that I've never used facecam before in these videos. I've been wanting to show up in my videos for a little while now, especially because I'm starting streaming again, which I should be doing right now at the moment. For some reason I'm jumping to Bloodlust, don't know why I'm doing that, but I am. So drop in there. The link to my Twitch will be in the description. Just to quickly give some general thoughts. I knew that Yata was a level with a reputation and some historic value. It's a level that many people remember vividly, along with the other great top ones of the past. Personally, I didn't have such a connection with it, but even playing it, I could tell that it was intense. And it's not helped by the difficulty of the level either. Not just because it's a hard level in an absolute sense. Some other people like EVW have talked about it, and probably this isn't an observation unique to me, but Yata is hard in a very balanced way. It's almost too well balanced. If you've ever played it, you'll know that it's not a level with enormous choke points that hold you up for long periods of time. The trouble is that you can die to every single part of that level. Every spike, every object can kill you. And on one hand you might think that sounds cool because you don't have to struggle against just 5% of the level killing you 90% of the time. But trust me, when the entire level can kill you, it feels like you have no control over what's going on. At least if there was a choke point that was 10% of the level, the remaining 90% would be easy, it would be under control. I felt right up until I completed this level that I had no clue what was going on, if I was improving or not. And it kind of leads me to my last main point about the level. It's something you could enjoy if you liked old levels, and levels that are old-fashioned, essentially. Yata isn't a level that doesn't hold up. The point isn't that it's dated. What's interesting is just that I could feel playing it that it was a type of gameplay and almost a whole philosophy that levels created now don't really have. There are loads of levels that are really slick, well-produced levels. You could think of a level like Aku, which, as a beginner extreme, is way more user-friendly than Cataclysm ever could have been, for example. You can feel, as you beat Aku, that you're really good at the game. It makes you feel like you're amazing. Yata does not give you that satisfaction by having slick, cool gameplay. Yata just hands you a level, and you just have to beat it. Now, that can be cool in its own way. I'm very happy, now that I've completed the level for myself. But at the time, it made for a big struggle. Yata is for sure demanding. I wish anyone, the best luck in the world, trying to beat it. And more than that, I've even got all of the tricks that I came up with along the way. But first, here is my completion. Come on. Oh my god. Is this real life? Is this fucking real life? I could cry. Oh my god. I've had a heart attack, I think. I really was so locked in. It's crazy that I didn't die to those last clicks, but I mean, practice, you know. Like, I really felt like I was destined, like, I was never gonna beat this level. I feel like that every single time I play this game. Like, when you get right up to the end of the process for a level, you always feel like you could be doing this for the rest of your life. Because you feel like you're good enough, but every attempt isn't. You have no idea what's gonna make the successful attempt any different. But Jesus Christ, this one dragged on for like a whole week longer. Like, this was torture. It just wouldn't budge. I can't believe it, man. I cannot believe it. This cube is the first part that I have specific advice for and a specific method for. It's one of the consistent parts of the level, but part of consistency is, a lot of the time, optimizing, even if it's easy anyway. If you're not sure exactly how it works, you can see the reflections, I suppose, of what is actually there underneath. So you jump over a triple spike and jump again onto a platform here. You then have to jump again over some spikes. There'll be a pad that bounces you up. You have to jump again over some spikes onto another platform, and then jump from that platform over into the portal, transition to the next area. You can do this in just 3 clicks, in a very consistent way. Firstly, you click and hold to jump over the triple spike, and then continue up onto the platform. I then like to release and do my second click independently here, and hold that again. If you try and hold all the way from earlier, and essentially buffer off of this platform, you'll often fall short. Once you do this separate click and hold, because you jump over, flip up here, this will make you automatically jump over these spikes and then up onto the platform. And finally on this platform, again, I like to do a separate click, because you can die both from clicking too early and too late. Too early, you will fall short, and if you go really, really late, it causes you to die doing the method I use here, which is I click here, the third click, and I hold it through the transition to the next area, which is here, because you start this part by jumping, and you can hold all the way from this input, and it will consistently make you jump here. And just to make sure everything was identical every time, that's what I did. It's also worth mentioning this part, probably, because even though there isn't too much specific to advise on, it's one of the biggest choke points in the level, frankly. It might not seem like it, but it's a very, very precise micro click. This is a blue orb, and you have to click it to land here but not jump, because obviously jumping will kill you. The best advice for this part, though, is to try and do these 2 orbs quickly. This is a yellow and a pink orb, I believe, and if you do them quicker, you'll land further left early on this pad instead of further along, and the earlier you come off of this pad and up, the more space horizontally you'll have to land after this click. If you're right on top of this spot here on the platform, it's very hard to do a short enough click. Later in this part, you also get another awkward pattern. It's not necessarily too difficult, but it can trip you up enough times that I think it's a good idea to understand it in detail. All the way from the straight fly here, which should be quite routine, you then transition to the ball, come off this pad up here, which is all auto, and the first click you have to do is to come off of this surface and then click this orb to flip back up, and then just roll off. The problem is that depending on how you time this orb, you will roll off in very different ways. And it's very easy to roll off by clicking too late, in such a way that even if you buffered this green orb, you would still hit the spikes at the top. So you want to be able to click this orb as early as possible, which means that right from when you enter this transition and it's auto, I would buffer, so it would automatically come off as the ball as early as possible. And then your job is just to click this blue orb as early as you can without buffering it. If you buffer, you will very often die by not even making it to the platform. If you click as early as you can, you'll at least have a big window to click here. And if you click a little bit later, you'll still be able to click and live, but you'll probably have to buffer it just to be safe. Any later and you'll still die to the spikes. I won't dwell on Jazer too long because I don't know what the consensus is with other people, but for me it was probably the most consistent part of the level. I would often have 80-90% success rates here, playing from 0. The thing to know, of course, is that many of the portals that flip gravity can be skipped. This one, for example, or even this one. The very first click you just go up, fall into a portal here, you're then upside down, and you can imagine you could click, release, click, and then release before even reaching this portal. You could do similar with this portal. However, I wouldn't do that with either of these because I just personally didn't find it necessary, and if anything, it complicated this part too much. It was very, very consistent without doing that, so I didn't do it. The one portal that I did skip was this one because, well, it's just very unnecessary. It does make the release here quite awkward, and this one is very easy to skip, especially because going into it, you are right side up, and so it just feels very natural to skip it and treat this like a typical wave pattern. The biggest issue with this part really has nothing to do with those tricks. It's the fact that this portal will get you killed if you go in too low. Here you're reversed, you fall in, click, release, hold, and if you release too late, and so too far down, when you come out you'll be quite low, and you'll have to do an extra click to avoid an obstacle that will kill you. If you release earlier, higher up, then you'll just fall straight down all the way without any problem, and so you should focus on doing that. Moving on to this general section afterwards, there isn't much in particular to say here, it's just generally quite difficult. The best advice that applies to the majority of the parts, I would say, is to keep the click pattern simple. When you're moving through this ship, I would often do as few as 1 or 2 clicks at a time. The same for here, where gravity flips as you go between the spikes. I wouldn't try and do loads of clicks, I'd just do 1 to sweep up, 1 again to sweep up, and keep it very simple. Many other difficult parts before the drop, which for example might include these timings, actually got very consistent. They just took a lot of being ingrained in my muscle memory, and while I was still developing that, being aware of exactly what I had to achieve. There are specific early and late timings here, for example, that you can figure out quite easily, but some of the trickier parts are nailing these clicks every time, which are actually a bit forgiving. You can get away with not being ultra precise here, but while you're still learning it, it might feel quite awkward. The trickiest input, of course, is the last one, where you click from up here to fall down, because to make this orb pattern work, you ideally want to click early enough that you clip this ledge and roll off. That means that when you buffer this, you'll be in range to hit this green orb every time. If you fall straight down, oftentimes, even if you buffer, you won't reach the green orb. There are also other timings, such as the ones here, but again, I actually found most of these very consistent. The jumps from the ledges, where you jump over the spikes, I found to have a somewhat forgiving window as well, that you really need to develop muscle memory for to solve. There's not much to go off visually. And then, of course, I think these orbs probably kill a lot of people more often than they'd like. First orb, of course, you just want to hit right in the middle. It's just executing this every time that's the hard part. From the drop, we have similarly a lot of parts that are difficult, that rely quite heavily on muscle memory, and in my experience, some specific click patterns, but generally don't present any insurmountable obstacle. This level is, of course, very balanced, as I've mentioned. The straight fly is, of course, very straightforward. The wave clicks here are also straightforward, micro click and a typical click here. These ball timings might seem very challenging, especially if you're not great at timings, but these also I found get very automatic and consistent. It's very clear how you need to click to survive them. Almost all of them you want to click as late as possible. On this ledge you want to click right as you roll up to the end. The same with this ledge and the same with this ledge. This of course isn't easy to execute, but it's very simple. This orb is the only one that's different out of these inputs. You want to click this orb on the earlier side, essentially right as you get in range of the orb. After the easier wave part, I'll also explain my particular click pattern for this ship. Very similar to Anthrax's ship in Artificial Ascent, this is another Anthrax part. It's a very vague ship section. You can't call it a straight fly, but it isn't limiting you to very specific clicks and click lengths. It just meanders in a vague open way. I would specifically do 1 click to ride up and down here, 1 click to ride up and down here, 2 clicks to come up and keep my trajectory up before falling down, and then another 2 clicks to try and ideally finish right in line with this gap, at which point I would try and do 1 final click, hopefully just to keep coasting, essentially not really much of a click at all, but if I was a bit too low, I could, for example, use that click to gain just enough height to survive, and that method worked very well consistently for me. This part being one of the more routine and ultra consistent parts of the level, there isn't much to be said about most of the inputs, although this specific input for a period of a few days or maybe a week did give me a bit of trouble and required some attention to iron out. The trouble is that you need to firstly jump high enough to reach the orb. You don't want to jump too low, but you also want to arrive at the orb and hit it in such a way that you can land on this ledge consistently without hitting the spike. If you're too low or you hit it too early, this green orb can just send you into the spike. You also want to land on the ledge properly, however, and I found this best trying to click somewhere in what I would visualize as the lower left of this orb. Essentially, as the robot, after the jump, I would try and wait until I was arcing down, falling just below the center line on the left side. It might seem a bit strange and particular and hard to visualize, but this is just the cue I use to try and get in the right zone on this green orb. Because once you land on this platform, you also want to make sure you jump late enough. If you land as far forwards as you can, and buffer, even if you hold all the way as the robot, you will not clear this cog. However, you don't really want to be waiting too long on this platform because it's just so short, and there's not really enough room to comfortably wait without occasionally dying to the spike. My specific orb timing also made it feel quite easy for me to jump off this platform consistently far enough along. In this part, at first I found this ship quite difficult. Maybe for a lot of people this could still be a very difficult part and the focus of this section. I did find that it got quite consistent, however, especially because the main trouble is at the beginning of this straight fly, making sure you can go through this gravity transition properly without dying from over or under adjusting as you come out of it. But as long as you hit this orb correctly, and the orb does feel like it's positioned in such a way that it will set you up quite consistently, you should arc out of the jump and settle perfectly in line with the straight fly. And ideally, the arc will end right as you're about to come up to the gravity portal. That being the case, I found that automatically, partially maybe because my muscle memory just learned it very well, but this became very consistent. What I have more specific advice for is this ball, which I, as I often do, came up with certain specific cues for just to make sure I was consistent every time, because a lot of these inputs are not super difficult, but can catch you out, especially when you're beginning to get nervous or you haven't gotten here very often. This very first click is quite easy. This second click is a bit trickier. My particular cue for this, I just tried to click just after I passed in line with the center of the spike. By clicking just after I felt I'd passed the spike, I was far enough along, but not too far along that I could make the gap. Seeing that this spike is further away, on this spike, I just clicked when I was perfectly in line. Then this closer spike, once again, I clicked just after. This input, actually I found very easy and consistent. This click is the hardest, I would say, of this part, that I have the most specific cue for, which is similar to one I've used before in Titan Complex. I tried to visualize a type of zone in this gap on the right edge of the spike. By clicking specifically in this gap, when I came down, I didn't die to the weird quirk of this transition that even if you click far enough right that you pass this spike, but not so far that you hit this spike, you can come down and live, but die by falling straight into the transition instead of landing on the ledge first. Seeing as you can't click too late, I specifically tried to click in this zone. This ship, though it might seem quite easy, and many people might find it very easy, I myself thought at first that it was a very easy part and that I had very good consistency. However, I also found that right up until the moment I beat the level, this part still gave me some trouble, even though I thought it was essentially free. The trouble is that it is very vague, and as such I frankly can't give any particular advice on how to pass this more consistently. It might look very open, and in many ways it is, but the nature of the speed of this part and trying to consistently make so many gravity changes, you are kind of leaving it up to chance. To make the first portal very consistent, what I would do is I would essentially try to straight fly into the top of the portal. You could fall down and click up so that you have the momentum going in the right direction as you transition, but seeing as that type of input is what you do for the rest of the parts, meandering down and up and down, I tried to eliminate that variance by making this a very consistent straight fly, essentially only doing 2 clicks to maintain my height coming off of the ledge, which you can't see, into the portal. Then moving on later, after clicking this orb and coming here, I would specifically do 3 clicks to maintain here. All you have to do is straight fly, but seeing as I was dying more than I wanted, to make it ultra consistent, I specifically would do 3 light clicks to straight fly here. I did 1 big click to go up, especially because it's quite easy to go in too low in this portal, and as you fall down, not have enough room and hit this spike every time. So going high enough up to get quite high into this portal, I would then do 1 slightly delayed input to adjust and come back up and straight fly out. This ball as well was a part that I thought would be very consistent, but especially as the pressure would build up towards the halfway point of the level here, I would have a lot of trouble with it. This very first input is troublesome because you have to click earlier than it might look. As such, I would try to click roughly just after I passed the first spike, and then the next 2 inputs that were the most dangerous were both coming off of the upper ledges here and here. How these work is that the first one you want to click on the later side. Obviously not coming too close to the spike and dying, but at least in the later half of this ledge I would click to come down. And then after this very easy input up, you want to click just on the earlier half of this ledge. You don't want to click too early to fall short of this ledge, but even though this ledge looks very short and difficult to get onto, you actually want to click essentially just before the halfway point, somewhere around the second quarter of the open space on this ledge to come down. Then after an easy click up and an input where you just have to make sure you've waited until you land on the ledge so that you don't buffer these orbs by accident. These clicks, like the very first one, you just want to make sure you do early enough and you don't wait too long and hit a spike. So just after you pass this spike and just after you pass this spike. Michigan, it must be said, is actually very consistent in this level, I would say. It's for sure my favourite Michigan Mega Collab part that I've played so far. It's once again very simple, but I find in a way that is actually quite enjoyable, that doesn't feel too repetitive and feels somewhat unique. The first clicks are quite straightforward. They are simply micro clicks that you want to make sure you don't click too late. The biggest danger is that you do the first 2 jumps and find yourself so close to the 3rd jump upon landing you don't have the room to clear the spike no matter what. First thing I would do to try and avoid this is make sure my transition was consistent so that I could be confident that I would be ready for the first jump 100% every time instead of being a bit uncertain as I was still focused on the spam. To do this, I would try to clear these last cogs with the same click pattern every time, especially the last cog. I would try and make sure to just go up and then fall down without having to think about my clicks after clearing the cog, so that I could prepare myself to just do these 3 inputs. The rest of these clicks are actually quite straightforward. In general, you don't want to click too close to the last spikes. You have some room to work with, particularly on this double spike. If you click too late, you'll actually die. So you want to click almost in the middle of these 2 spikes either side. The wave is actually just very consistency based, and while it might look tight, there is, to be honest, quite a lot of room. This is then just a very normal triple spike. It's not a particularly dangerous one for Michigan standards. And the final jump that of course you need to do, because falling off will kill you, is made a lot easier by the fact that this torch thing has helpfully been placed as a marker, and if you just click perfectly in line with it, then you will make the jump. This part is really supposed to just be there to increase your nerves rather than present much difficulty, but in this part in particular I did find myself dying a couple of times, which hurt more because of how easy I thought this part should be. As such, I would firstly make sure that I didn't come down too late as the ball here. I would make sure that I gave myself a bit of room to click because I knew it would be so free a timing. Of course, you've got to hit these orbs a bit later so that you can go far enough along to survive this orb and not fall short. And then from this click onwards, I would make sure that after clicking to come down, I would buffer the next click just to 100% eliminate any risk here, and that coming up to this, I would again leave enough room so that I wouldn't die, and then buffer the next 2 to eliminate all of that risk as well. It's also worth mentioning that quite often buffering off of this ledge would be too early and would get you killed, but that generally wasn't in my muscle memory anyway. I don't think that's what most people would have a tendency to do naturally. The transition to the swing copter is something I had a bit of trouble with, but my advice unfortunately isn't very specific. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue outright. What I actually found was the best thing to focus on to nail this transition, which can be quite nerve-wracking because of how much lead up there is and how it kind of breaks your flow going into it, is that I would essentially just watch the ball. It might sound very simple, but I would just watch the ball as I came up. And so instead of trying to time the first click to come back down in this gap with a visual cue or anything like that, I would just make sure to keep my eye on the ball and try and focus on guiding it through the gap without overthinking and focusing on the other obstacles, but instead focusing on the object itself. Once again, this ship is quite easy and is generally more of a filler part that isn't supposed to present much threat. Once again, as is more common with these types of parts, trying to do simpler click patterns I found was generally safer. And in particular, after coming down here and trying to straighten out here, coming up to this next click, I would try to keep a little bit lower, as I found that trying to keep a bit too high up made it more likely that upon clicking here in the dark, I could, by accident, clip this spike. This final part is probably the hardest part towards the end of the level. After doing this simple ship duel and just straight flying in, this is of course a very rough wave. The texture of the corridor looks quite jagged and uncertain, and there are certain parts, as you can see here, that just aren't very wave shaped. I wouldn't personally go up, down and wiggle through. I would try to just release perfectly in line. Perhaps this isn't as consistent for you and you would prefer a different click pattern. You would have to experiment for yourself. In the end, while this wave gave me some trouble, I didn't have to get here very often. I only got here maybe 5 times before I beat the level, and even then I found the clicks, given that it is quite slow, got somewhat consistent. The part that I had a specific method for was this ball input actually, because it specifically killed me. Of the 3 times I got here before beating the level, the first 2 times right on this click. The way I timed it was once again by visualizing the gap on the right side of this spike. If I waited to there, I would click and I would come down without going too far and hitting the spike, and also without clicking too early and clipping this ledge, which was an issue that I discovered with this part, and which would guarantee that you would die. Maybe it's just me, and this won't have fooled anyone else, but just in case no one knows, or certain people didn't notice, the top spikes aren't real here. You just go in the top half. Took me a solid week and a half or something before I realised that was the case. Finally, although ever since the ball that we looked at a moment ago, much of the rest of this part leading up to the last 15% was generally quite consistent, nailing this final outro and transition to the next part was quite crucial to my consistency here. The issue is that though this is kind of vague and something you could get through on feel, for me I wanted a very specific click pattern, particularly to make the transition consistent, and for me very crucial to that was nailing this first orb. My click pattern was to click the orb to come up, and then as the ship I could do 2 clicks that would get me the perfect distance where I could fall back down through this gap, and then do another 1 or 2 clicks to come up. And generally I was able to do a specific number of clicks to coast through very consistently that would then lead me into the portal. If doing those first 2 clicks, I did them after going too late on the orb, I often would go too far. So instead of going too late, I would wait until I was perhaps a third or a quarter of the way down. I wouldn't buffer, because if you buffer it will kill you, but I would wait to do something between an early and a neutral timing to click this orb, which would send me just far enough I could do the 2 clicks without dying. However, it must be said this is probably a very individual part that you should do a lot of personal experimentation on to understand. The final 15%, while being obviously the most nerve-wracking section of the level, was actually generally very consistent in practice, and I only got here once. I fluked this part, but 1 out of 1 is, well, it's 100%, it's perfectly consistent. Once again, a lot of it comes down, in my opinion, to trying to be simple and consistent with the clicks. This click in particular, as you come down as the ship, I found it very important to try my best to do just 1 click to come back up, rather than trying to do a couple or overcomplicate this maneuver. Later at this strangely shaped part, we have to dodge both the ledges and the walls of, they should be fire really, given the reference, but swords. As I came over and cleared this line and fell down, I liked to do just 1 click to come back up all the way. Sometimes I would instinctively do a couple of quick clicks, but roughly just 1 input here was ideal. At this final UFO, I had a very specific click pattern. For the 2 sets of jumps, the first one I would do 1, 1, 2, 3. The second I would do 1, 1, 2, 1. And that for me was very, very easy and consistent. And on these final clicks, very simple. The first triple spike is quite self-explanatory. To clear this jump, my ideal cue was to jump somewhere in the middle of this speed change, or perhaps between the start of the speed change and the spike. In this middle area was actually the best timing for me, not coming up too close to the spike, that was too dangerous. And then once again on this click, which you can hold all the way over, I actually preferred to click right in the middle of this space, not too close to the triple spike. Clicking too close to the triple spike would actually break down the timings that I used at the next part, which is to make these orbs consistent. Given that I did this well by clicking right in the middle and holding all the way, I would buffer the very first orb, and then the second two orbs I would wait a little bit and click in time to the song, which I'll try and demonstrate here. This would lead me into perhaps the most nerve-wracking clicks of the level, in particular these first two. Quite simply, you want to hit this with a neutral timing, buffering, you'll hit the saws, and then this has to be a very, very short micro click, which, given the nerves, is very difficult to execute, or at least very stressful to execute. Then the final two orbs is a simple hold, and this is a simple click. And of course the final thing to make sure you do is not buffer this click too early and fall short, but to wait just a split second, a tiny moment, so that you will clear both of the spikes. And for this final pattern, which might be quite awkward to execute for some people, especially for the first time, I found what was very, very consistent was splitting them up into two sets of two. Instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, I would try and do a quick 1, 2, then a small delay for another 1, 2, and hold. And that's it. It's a mixed bag. There's some stuff that's doable, there's some stuff that's hard, there's a lot of stuff that will kill you. Do your best to stay in the game, and, don't get down on yourself and keep pushing. And that's it. Have fun.